Now I wanted to share with you some survey results of 750. Oh no, let me first get the slides well. Okay, so 750 multinational investor and corporate executives that were surveyed, and the results were published in the Global Investment Competitiveness Report that is regularly issued by the UN Conference for Trade and Development that we talked about already before, that is mainly in charge of FDI data. And they basically surveyed the investors on the importance of country characteristics. So since we've been talking about what is actually important for investors, and they asked them about several factors, and they had to choose between the options dark green or darker green, which is critically important, lighter green is important, orange is somehow important, and I don't know, reddish color here, brownish, reddish, is not at all important, and the blue is don't know. Yeah? So basically, it's not about here mainly choosing what is important and what is not. You see, with the importance, there are already 3 categories of critically important, just important, and somewhat important, because it's obvious that in a way or another, many of those factors are important, but the question is also to allow for some sort of ranking, prioritizations, and so on. So the first thing that 50% said is critically important, an additional 37% said that is important, and almost all the rest said somewhat important. So there is a big consensus on the importance is political stability and security. So you see here the importance of political institutions that we've been talking about, and actually the fact that the most important factor here in the country characteristics is not even an economic factor. But this political institution is so important, and so many economic institutions actually depend on this political institution. Because if you don't have political stability and security, you can forget about everything else. Right? The politics are so in turbulence, and there is not a proper political stability you can rely on. There is a conflict, there is war, there is continuous coup d'etat. You can't really rely on the economic even situation to be reliable. You're risking your investment. You don't know what's coming next, and investors hate uncertainty. Any uncertainty means it reduces your expected profitability, and we said investors go by expected profitability. So they have to be thinking that the profit is so high that they basically would be risking to have such a risky kind of investment. So this is super important and comes on top as a top criteria. The second one is legal and regulatory environment, where again, if you add up all the factors on importance, almost everyone agrees that it's important. 40% say it's critically important, and additionally 46% said it is important. So together, really close to 90%, and the rest almost says somehow important. So legal and regulatory environment. So again,
We cannot hear you anymore. You're muted.
was it just now? Okay, so you can see that the laws and regulations, the legal framework is super important here. And you see 2 institutional factors here on the top, political and legal. And they are very important ultimate reasons behind economic factors that come afterwards. Because if the legal and the regulatory environment is not working properly, probably property rights are not working properly in the country as well. That's part of the legal and the regulatory environment that you have for investors. Yeah. So this is very important. Then, as third, comes large domestic market size. And it's clear that the large domestic market size is not important for every single investors. Those that are market seeking, they of course care more about it than those that are efficiency seeking. But still, you can see here that there is a big dominance in the importance also of the large market size here. 42% say it's critically important and 38%, so together 80% say important or critically important. And very little here, 4% say it's not important at all. And maybe because they are looking for another kind of FDI, efficiency seeking FDI, strategic FDI, resource seeking FDI. So that could be the reason. Or maybe also though that say somehow important because the market seeking element is not their first priority. Okay, and then again, another factor from the investment framework comes the macroeconomic stability and favorable exchange rate. So they care about exchange rate, they care about the macroeconomic stability, not too high inflation. What about the interest rate? What about the role of the central bank? All is also very important here, or relatively important here, with 43%, almost 1/3 say it's critically important, 44% say it's important, and 16% somewhat important. And then comes the labor force. Available talent and skilled labor force, but you see it's only critically important for 28%. So maybe many rely on the fact that they are going to educate the labor force, or they're going to learn, show them the skill. Maybe some are going for not high skilled kind of activity, so it's not very important to have a strongly skilled labor. Other factors definitely seem to be of bigger importance than this, but it's not that it's unimportant. Still, 28 say critically important, 45% it's important, and so on. The infrastructure, 25% say it's critically important, and another 46% here say it is important. If you add up all together, it is a relatively important aspect, and few say it's not important at all. And then here you see comes factors where those that think it's really critically important are even below 20%. So the group gets smaller, and where also the group of those that say it's not important at all starts to get bigger, like low tax rates, low cost of labor and input. So you see here, the cost issue is not the primary issue here. It is important, yes, but if you have problems with economic stability and political stability and legal framework, you're not going to attract foreign companies just by offering low tax rates. And this is important, because what we've seen worldwide is a lot of, tax competition between countries, race to the bottom, trying to attract companies by low tax rates, which at the end of the day, when everyone does it, it's not a competitive edge anymore. So if many countries offer a tax break, it doesn't matter at the end, because, okay, this is common factor among everyone, but where are other differences that are important? And if we think, you should take also those factors when we prioritize about the government policies and policy recommendations regarding how can actually developing countries attract FDI. Many think, okay, the most important thing is reduce taxes, but actually their homework is a much bigger one here. I mean, the political stability, the security, the institutions and the legal framework and the regulatory environment and the investment climate, the macroeconomic stability, the exchange rate, the market size is actually not just the population, but it is also how much money the population has. Because you can have a big market with many people, but they are all poor. So you can't really target here lots of consumption, but also part of it is actually a population that is also doing well and can actually afford different things, and is also of a certain economic level and so on. The infrastructure, all of this is homework of governments. and is much more important actually than reducing tax rates. And as you can see, all those factors, they are general ones in the economic setup of the country and the economic institutions of the country. These are, if you want, win-win factors or all-winner factors. If you have economic stability and if you have political stability and if you have proper institutions, it's not only important for FDI, but it's actually even having a direct impact on the country's growth and development. One is because it attracts more investors, but it's also good for local investors. It's also good for people to, when they have stability, they invest more in education, in their own education, in the education of their children. So these are factors that are a winner on so many levels and actually solve many development challenges, not just how to attract FDI. And so actually, when we think of what governments can do, should be on top of the list and definitely much, much higher than considering just things like the taxes for foreign companies. Yeah, because actually also part of the taxes is actually to finance development. So there has always to be a very big justification on why to reduce that for foreign companies. For example, if the foreign company comes and says, okay, we want to have this tax break, but on the contrary, or on the other side, we're basically going to develop the infrastructure ourselves, or we are going to offer trainings to locals, or we're going to do this or that, then there is also a developmental impact out of this. But just to reduce it to think that this is what is going to make the country attractive and competitive and attract investors is actually has proven empirically to be just a waste of taxes. Yeah, access to land and real estate financing in the domestic market. So you can see somehow important factors, mainly is the biggest group here. Yeah, relatively important, but definitely not critically important as other factors. So if we summarize that here, the investor survey shows that political stability and security, along with stable legal and regulatory environment, these were our two top factors, are the leading country characteristics considered by executives in multinational companies that they take into consideration before they do a commitment of having an investment in a new venture. And we can also conclude from that these considerations far outweigh things like investment incentives, such as to reduce tax rates or to reduce the labor costs. These, as we've seen here, are much more down in the list than those other factors that are definitely of higher priority. So we can say that investment incentives, yes, may help to attract FDI, but are generally only effective if they are other important prerequisites are met. So if an investor has two locations, both offer political stability and economic stability and a large market and macroeconomic stability and all those other factors, then they'd rather go to a location where you have lower tax rate. But if you don't have the political or the economic stability, forget about the tax rate issue. This is not going to be the attractive thing. So when investment is motivated by a desire to access the domestic market or to extract natural resources and so on, investment incentives like lower tax incentives are not usually effective here if those other more important factors that outweigh these are not already met. So this is what we see from empirics here, from asking investors about what is the most important for them. Now, I would like to move on with a very important part here of the chapter, which is about the discussion on how FDI has an impact on economic development and basically linking whatever we've learned so far in this FDI chapter with our understanding of economic development that we already did previously in this course. So what we want to look at here is the following. What are potential positive effects of FDI on economic development? But what also, for any balanced discussion, as we've said, we need to also look at the downside or the challenges or the risks and so on. So we're going to look at, on the one hand, what are limitations of those positive effects that we're talking about, but also potential negative effects that FDI could have on economic development. These are all theoretical arguments. Then we're going to look at empirical evidence from data, empirically quantitative analysis of data from FDI in different countries, and see whether FDI actually managed to have a positive impact on economic growth in developing countries. And then our final question here, when we finish off the chapter, is basically, given all this knowledge of the chapter and all what we've learned, what can governments actually do to maximize their benefit from FDI? Taking into account what are channels of positive effects, but also what are risks and limitations, then we can think of what are policy recommendations maybe for governments in developing countries to basically maximize the possible impact of FDI. So this is the remaining agenda here for this chapter. And now I would like to stop sharing and get back to you and basically ask you, what do you think? How can FDI affect economic development in a recipient developing country? For the discussion, it would be better if we can see each other better, if you can see more of you on the screen, and if more engage here in the activities. So let's see who would like to start. Kuber.
I think for the starter, for example, because of FDI, I think GDP will increase, the production in the country will increase.
Okay.
And then
why?
Because the product is being produced in that country, so there will be an economic growth in that aspect. But also, I think employment will increase because there is a need for new employers. And yeah, those two things.
Okay, so other than remittances, where we said they are not a direct part of GDP, FDI in a country, this is local investments in the country. They contribute to the capital of the country, contribute to investments in the country, and contribute to economic growth in the country. Now, we need also to talk about the channels through which they affect economic growth. Is it just because it's direct production, or are there also multiplier effects that affect economic growth? So we need to comment on that as well. Another argument you've mentioned is about the employment. Yes, it means basically people are going to be employed in those activities. So reducing unemployment, allowing more employment options in the country is another factor. Yes. What are other factors you can think of? And here I'm opening the discussion for you to mention positive or negative sides if you want. So if you're thinking more of negative impact or limitations of those positive impacts that we're speaking about, you're also free to address that. So let's collect more arguments. I'll take Viviana and then Tanusha, and then we'll see if we have more. Please.
Thinking of multiplier effects, the thing that comes to mind is that if unemployment is reduced because of the presence of foreign direct investment, then people have more money for consumption, which in turn helps other businesses, and they may also have long-term effects, as maybe families can afford to keep kids in school or spend in healthcare, which helps in the long run. And in terms of negative effects, I was thinking of something that happens in my country. In my country, there is a lot of foreign direct investment when it comes to the manufacturing sector. And one of the reasons why the minimum wage is quite low in Mexico is because of the presence of these companies, because the government knows that if it raises the minimum wage, then Mexico is no longer going to be attractive for these companies because they come to Mexico because of the cheap labor. So in a way, the effect that it has on people's well-being is a bit limited because they have low wages.
Okay, but do you think that the wage reflects the people's productivity or not? or is it an underpayment regarding the
Underpaid,
productivity?
definitely. For example, in the maquiladoras, which are kind of like clothes manufacturing companies that are in the north part of Mexico, they are severely
Close to the
underpaid
US
and
borders?
they don't work in very good conditions.
Okay. Okay, so you're talking more about suppressing the labor market conditions somehow to maintain low wages and low production costs and so on. Okay, more arguments either on the positive or the negative side? Tanusha?
I think one positive effect is the spillover effect, which we talked about, that the incoming firms bring new technology and the home firms can learn from it and get the new technology. And one possible negative effect would be that there could be environmental issues because they I don't know how to describe it, but it could be that they would not really care about the environmental issues in the other countries because it is not their own home country. So that could be a possible negative effect.
Yeah, very good. Two very good points. So one on the positive side, the spillover effects that we talked about, and we talked also about different channels through which this can happen. And I'm going to address this again on the slides. And the other thing is a possible negative effect. What about environmental impacts? And especially there is sometimes the concern saying, well, those big companies, they come from countries where the environmental standards are tighter, and they go to other countries where the environmental standards are looser and are engaged in activities that maybe they couldn't have done at home, given the environmental regulations. So what about local impact on environmental degradations, but also still the impact on the global environmental degradation that everyone is sharing? And what about also local effects such as local polluting of water there, or the air, or things that have an impact on the people of that country and so on. So that's a common addressed negative or a common addressed concern, if you want, about activities of foreign companies. Okay, more arguments to address. Fidelia and then Jihyun.
Yeah, I think for FDI can also increase market competitiveness, which can help maybe break through like the domestic monopoly companies, and that will definitely benefit consumer, I think, because we have more various choices.
Right, that's a very good argument. So often you have local monopolies, and they are monopoly in the market because basically there is no competition in the local market. Maybe it's not very easy for the local market to develop competitors because the market is underdeveloped, because it needs too much capital to start a competitive business and so on. But having the competition from abroad basically increases efficiency. And this is an argument that we also generally mentioned when we talked about globalization. So increasing efficiency when you allow for imports because you have the competition from abroad, or also when you allow for FDI to enter the country and also foreign producers to be competitively producing. Another thing is not just to have a competition, but also that sometimes the local production was not really efficient to begin with. I was not of good quality, maybe was not up to high standards. So this would also encourage the local competitors basically to also be more up to date and to be more efficient, and to not to exploit the consumers by having too high prices and so on. Yeah. Okay. Jihyun?
I think actually what I was about to say was just what you explained to us right now. So since the economic growth, there's better economic growth and also the efficiency. So there will be more trade. So we can also, I think of this in terms of like comparative advantage too. So like they can have very active like trade, and they can maximize their production and also profit maximization too. But then
Uh-huh.
at the same time, for the negative impact, as you just said a while ago, in terms of environmental issues. So since they have to increase the production, of course, they will need more factories. And through the factories, there are really serious problem in terms of air pollution, right? So I think that will be probably the negative impact, but I'm not quite sure if this also includes.
Okay, so regarding the positive impact that you were mentioning about trade, yes, it's also possible, especially when you think of efficiency-seeking FDI. We mentioned market-seeking FDI, it's mainly going to produce data to reach the local market. So they are not necessarily exporting a lot from there. Maybe they are when we consider that they want to export to other markets in the region, then there is exports as well. But also efficiency-seeking FDI, as you remember, we said they go to a certain location just because it's very efficient to do a certain part of the production process there, and they are going to export what they produce again to another part of the world where they continue on the production, or maybe to the home country again. So sometimes the engagement of those foreign companies also increase the exports of the foreign of the hosting country strongly, and this also makes the country now more engaged in international trade, more familiar with export practices. So this also encourages other producers in the country to be more participating in the international markets. I gave you last time, I think already the example, if I'm not mistaken, when I talked about the Samsung factory in Egypt that is producing electronics, flat screens, and tablets and so on, and that 90% of Egyptian exports in the field of electronics are from the Korean companies in Egypt. And it's not that the Korean companies in Egypt are the largest FDI, not at all. I mean, if we rank the countries, maybe it comes, I don't know, maybe 10th or maybe lower. So it's not that it's the most source of FDI. You have lots of European FDI in the country, lots of American FDI in the country. So it's not highest, but in the field of electronics, they seem to find a niche where there is a gap in the country, where there is lots of potential to engage the local labor force, where there's already a huge Egyptian market, but also a huge regional market, as I told you. Exports from there to the Middle East countries, to the African countries, and even to European countries. So from that, it's possible basically to increase the country's export. It's good for the country's trade balance. It's good for being more participating in the international trade, not just its importer, but also exporter. And also, of course, with all the other benefits of that kind of factory, to learn from the Korean technology, to educate the labor force there, and so on. I don't want to take all the advantage arguments from you, but think more about how can Egypt, for example, benefit from this kind of factory there. Think of more arguments than the ones that we've already mentioned. Fidelia?
Yeah, actually, the argument that I make could also be seen as the negative side of FDI. Like imagine the domestic companies would be crowded out because people would trust more these bigger companies or like the foreign companies in terms of the products and the quality. And I think that could be one of the negative side of FDI. And on top of that, we talked about how FDI was quite resilient in like big events. So imagine if developing countries really hold on to like this FDI or like big companies, and the pandemic happened, and it could definitely decrease their developing or like development. You're still muted, Professor.
You mean that's part of the risk of globalization, that you are more prone to or more vulnerable to the global risks, and that they affect you more. So yes, that's of course a general argument of globalization. And when it's the domestic investment, when it's the investments in your own country, yes. And we've talked already before, if you remember, how there was a drop in FDI with the financial crisis, and we've seen at the beginning of the chapter the impact of COVID. So yes, this can be an issue. And you've mentioning the crowding out of the local companies. So the idea is basically being a competition for the locals, and being maybe a more efficient competitor could basically crowd out, that's an important term in economics, so kick out basically the locals from the market because they cannot compete. Well, there is a good and a bad side about it. So first, yes, it can basically destroy already existing companies, the existences of this existing companies in the home country, because they can't compete with that. But also on the other hand, maybe they were also super inefficient. So if this was the case, then it was actually not a very efficient use of the already scarce resources in the country. Maybe they can do something else, or join forces, or be suppliers, or competitors, or so when you think about if they were so inefficient, or maybe monopolies in the country, so they were already at the cost of the consumers, the people of the country, and it was an inefficient use of the resources. So from an economic perspective, it's good to increase the efficiency by having more efficient production. Of course, at the micro level for those companies, it could mean some companies have to shut down, some people become temporarily maybe unemployed until they find another employment opportunity. Yes, but if you think about it, well, they probably would need to readjust their business, do something else, do something maybe more related that is different. So maybe from a direct impact, you can see a negative consequence, but if you think of the dynamics of the economy, they were probably not just shut down for good, but actually do something else. Maybe they have to adjust, maybe they have to join forces with the other company, something like that. Because this is exactly the same argument to say have closed borders or allow for imports. It's a parallel argument to say imports crowd out also domestic production somehow, because maybe the local competition is not competitive enough. Yes, but does it help to just shut out the competition for good? This argument was tried out in many countries. Protect infant industry argument, very classical argument in protectionism. Close markets, not get your market exposed to the international competition, to protect it until it's ready enough. But historical, empirical evidence is the markets never get ready. Because if there is not this kind of competitive pressure, there is mostly no incentive to compete. So the producers become very relaxed that they are protected in that setup, and there is no need basically to catch up. What happens is often the gap gets bigger between the countries that are more developed and have better technology and so on, and it's more difficult to at any point in time be then competitive. Okay, more arguments. And don't just think about the direct impacts. I want you also to think more about the multiplier effects, about more spillover effects on the economy, secondary, third effect, and so on. But whatever you have in mind, please mention positive or negative. Maite, did you want to say, or your hesitant? The environment. Yeah, so these environmental risks are very important, especially in certain sectors. So, for example, the natural resource seeking FDI, the question is it how much environment